Why are there no alternative options in US politics? The majority of Americans believe both the Democrats and Republicans are doing such a bad job at representing them that a third major party is needed. But despite this, Americans that go to vote for someone else are often accused of throwing their vote away.
That's a wasted vote.
No.
The voting system in the US puts minor parties at such a disadvantage that most presidential polling projections don't even bother including them.
Third-party candidates have zero, zilch, no chance.
The last time the US had a president that wasn't a Democrat or Republican was the 1850s. And while Australia's not too different when it comes to our leaders, if you look at our parliament, there's a whole rainbow of political parties being represented. It might not be quite as colourful as some other leading democracies, but it's definitely not as two-tone as the US. The US is pretty much the only major democracy in the world that is exclusively represented by just two political parties on a national level. So why is it so hard for a third party to succeed in the US? One major factor is the US pretty much exclusively decides its national elections by first past the post voting. In this system, whoever gets the most votes wins, which sounds about as democratic as you can get, but according to Duverger's law, almost always ends up leading to a two-party system, largely because of vote splitting.
We have a voting system that makes third parties spoilers and wasted votes.
For example, if you don't think the Democrats are left-wing enough and vote for the Greens instead, technically you're just making it likelier that the right-wing Republican Party wins, because you're taking votes away from the Democrats.
Partisans on each side are so afraid of the other party being in power that they don't want to do anything that they think that might contribute to that.
Splitting the vote isn't something that a lot of other democracies have to worry about. In Australia, for example, we have ranked choice voting. If your top choice comes last and is eliminated, your vote then goes to your next choice, and so on. Even if you vote for a candidate you think has no chance of winning, you never have to feel like your vote is being wasted. But what about countries that don't use ranked choice voting? Germany, for example, uses first past the post, like the US, but it also has a mixed member proportional representation system. Basically, every voter in Germany gets two votes. One for a local candidate in their district, like in the US, but also a second vote for a political party. This second vote makes sure each party ends up with a number of seats that matches their overall popularity. This is the proportional representational part of their system. For example, in the 2021 German election, the Greens only won 5% of seats in the first vote, but because their overall popularity in the second vote was 15%, they were awarded extra seats to make sure their total number of seats was also 15%. Now, the way that the US elects its president is a bit different to how it elects people to Congress, but it's still pretty much first past the post with a twist. That twist is the Electoral College.
Electoral votes.
Battleground territory.
7 battleground states, they'll probably decide this race.
Instead of the winner needing the most votes, they need the most electoral votes. And you get electoral votes by winning a state.
We flip Pennsylvania to red, and then we get Trump to 281 electoral votes.
Pretty much every state is decided by first past the post, and the result is winner takes all. So it doesn't matter if you win California by 4% or 40%, you get every single one of its 54 electoral college votes. To get an idea of how much harder this makes it for anyone that isn't a Democrat or Republican, look no further than the most popular outsider candidate of the past 100 years, a guy called Ross Perot.
Now, all these fellas with $1,000 suits and alligator shoes running up and down the halls of Congress, they'll be over there in the Smithsonian, you know. Because we're going to get rid of them.
In 1992, he managed to convince almost 20 million Americans to vote for him as an independent.
And the American people, they're not as stupid as Washington thinks they are.
But winning almost 20% of the popular vote still translated to 0 electoral college votes, because he didn't manage to win any states. The more direct impact third-party candidates have in presidential elections is actually taking votes away from one side or the other, which is why third-party voters will sometimes get criticised during a close election.
Occasionally, they have been more likely to take from one candidate than the other, enough in a close election to make a difference.
The most extreme example of this happened in 2000.
I think that we need less partisanship.
It is time for new leadership in Washington, D.C.
Both candidates needed Florida's 25 electoral votes to win the presidency, and Republican George W. Bush ended up winning the state by just 537 votes, 0.009% of the vote. Meanwhile, 100,000 people voted for the left-wing Greens candidate, Ralph Nader.
In the end, the Democratic Party must face the fact that it has abandoned its progressive roots.
If just a fraction of those votes had gone to the centre-left Democrat, Al Gore, he would have become the president.
Our disappointment must be overcome by our love of country.
So why does all of this matter? And what's the actual impact of living in a system where there's pretty much only two parties? Firstly, it limits representation. If you're someone that doesn't identify with either party, it's easy to feel like your voice doesn't matter.
They're not listening to our demands, and so, really what's the difference?
It also makes it more difficult for voters to respond to decisions made by their party. For example, if a number of Democrat voters aren't happy with their party's policies on the Middle East, they don't really have many options, particularly if they disagree with the Republican Party's policies even more.
I hate to say it, I'm going to be anti-Trump voter no matter what happens.
In comparison, let's take a look at how a similar situation played out in Australia in 2022. Traditional Liberal voters who weren't happy with their party's direction on issues like climate change,
this is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
but would never consider supporting Labor, decided to instead back a number of Teal independents who more closely lined up with their values.
The wave of Teal candidates picked off key seats in Liberal heartlands.
For so long we have been ignored and taken for granted. Our climate has changed.
Yeah! The voters ended up with politicians that represented them without having to compromise. Another big side effect of an exclusively two-party system is that it can contribute to a more polarised and toxic political environment. If there's no option C, parties only need to be the lesser of two evils. This doesn't just lower the bar of expectations, it also incentivises parties to be negative, because you just need to make your opponent look worse than you are.
It's the same thing over and over again. All they do is fight, fight, fight. It's like the Itchy and Scratchy show.
Constant negativity makes things toxic, which makes compromise harder, and the polarisation can begin to spiral. In a multi-party system, if all you do is attack, you might be successful at making another party look bad, but it doesn't guarantee voters are going to vote for you instead.
In countries with multiple parties, the level of out-party hatred is less.
There's a reason why the saying isn't the lesser of three evils. So, will Americans ever get that third major party the majority are hoping to see? Well, it would likely take some pretty big reforms to change the system and make it more friendly to minor parties. And there are two big things standing in the way of that. The first is that you'd need to convince the two major parties to vote against their best interests. The second is that each individual state has control over how it runs its elections. So you'd also need to convince every single state individually to make the same changes. A few states have started to introduce things like ranked choice voting, and a number are weighing up giving out electoral votes proportionally. But the reality of a multi-party American democracy is still a long way away.